In 1907, Oklahoma had become a state, and one of the first laws they passed was the Jim Crow Law. Greenwood was developed on Indian territory, the vast area where Native American tribes had been forced to relocate. Some African Americans who had been former slaves integrated into tribal communities. They had acquired allotted land in Greenwood through the Daws Act, a U.S. law that gave land to individual Native Americans. Oklahoma begins to be prompted as a safe haven for African Americans who start to come, particularly post-emancipation, to Indian Territory, says Michelle Place, the executive director of the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum. O.W. Gurley, a wealthy black landowner, purchased 40 acres of land in Tulsa, named it Greenwood, and O.W. Gurley would actually loan money to people who wanted to start a business, says Christy Williams, the vice chair of the African American Affairs Commission in Tulsa. J.B. Stratford, for example, was born into slavery in Kentucky, but later, becoming a lawyer and activist, moved to Greenwood in 1898. He built a 55-room luxury hotel bearing his name, the largest black-owned hotel in the country. African Americans volunteered to be soldiers in Europe, specifically in France, and they were liberators, and they were treated well and were treated with honor. But when they came to the United States, they were faced with the Jim Crow restrictions. So to come back to a country with restrictions and oppression was shocking, and there was an element of violence with the rise of the Klan and Jim Crow. In the United States, the Native Americans and African Americans alike were treated as subservient. The majority white class considered them less than, and in contrast, though, those in the category who were considered less than were more educated and attended influential universities. They had become highly creditable aspects of their society as pharmacists, attorneys, accountants, physicians, business owners, and educators. Education was everything for the Greenwood district. However, there was a situation where the white population in some demographics in Oklahoma were not educated and they were not economically in a positive position. In 1919 and the early 1920s, no matter how appreciated the African soldier was treated and what heroes they were in Europe, in the United States, an affluent African American community would attract unwanted attention of local white residents, who resented the upscale lifestyle of people they deemed to be an inferior race. I think the word jealousy is certainly appropriate during this time, says Place. If you have particularly poor whites who are looking at this prosperous community who have large homes, fine furniture, crystal, furs, china, linens, the reaction is they don't deserve that. Blacks in Greenwood feared racial violence in the United States and the removal of their voting rights, and the lynchings proliferated across the country, particularly during the Red Summer of 1919. Where anti-black riots erupted in major cities across the United States, including Tulsa. The thriving and wealthy and one of the most wealthy parts of the country for black and Native Americans was segregated by a railroad track. So the superior feeling of not being superior becomes an issue of how do you control those who are not in your eyes as good as you are? With fear and violence. And that is what was taking place across the United States, when what could have been a simple misunderstanding between two teenagers has now become a part of our history that has been ignored and shoved under a rug. And now this year, being the anniversary of 100 years ago in 1921, coming up this May 31st, was the start of the 2-day massacre and destruction of one of the most influential and amazing districts for the Native American and African Americans, Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma. One false accusation could end someone's life, and in this case, thousands of lives were affected by one accusation between two teenagers. Dick Rowland, at 19 years old, was limited on the restrooms he could use on the white side of the tracks. So he went to the Drexel building and went up the elevator, and a young woman of 17, named Sarah Page, was working as the elevator operator. We do not know what happened. Some say he ran into her, others say he bumped her on accident. But when the elevator door opened, Sarah screamed, getting the attention of all of the white men and women in the area of the building. As they started to approach the young man, the rumors began on both sides of the track. Tensions were growing, and the angry mob mentality began to set in. Dick Rowland was soon arrested and taken to the courthouse, which was on the white side of the tracks. The newspaper, Tulsa Tribune, prints an article in response to the rumors, and the Tulsa Star encourages that the blacks should take up arms and show up at the courthouse and jail to make sure they do not lynch this young man who would be put on trial if he were not taken and killed by the white lynch mobs. An angry white mob heads to the courthouse demanding that the sheriff hand over Rowland. The sheriff refused, and soon a group of about 25 armed black men, including many World War I veterans, go to the courthouse to offer help to guard Rowland. The sheriff tells the men to go home and that he will be protected and to not worry. But the newspaper goes out, and the news spreads fast, and a crowd grows in the area near the courthouse. A group of around 75 armed black men returned to the courthouse, where they were then met with 1,500 whites. Tensions are high, and both sides are at the courthouse. That mob mentality has gotten worse, and words are exchanged. After clashes between the groups, the black men decide to retreat to Greenwood because they are outnumbered and they want to protect their homes and businesses. So they set up a perimeter to protect their district. Outnumbered, outgunned, and the devastation is near. Murder, mayhem, and destruction. The government did not help. No fire trucks came to put out the fires. And at the time, planes were a large way of watering crops, and such was very common, especially in Tulsa. Not one was utilized to save their homes. No one was prosecuted, and there was an estimated of over 300 civilians who were murdered. While complete, accurate records are not available, we do know there were over 11,000 residents in Greenwood, Oklahoma. So, how was no one held responsible? A community like theirs never to be as prosperous and affluent again. 100 years ago this May 31st, and there are still many unanswered questions. A commission is being built in Greenwood, and there is raising awareness of the history center of this story, and there are more plans in the next year or so, as Tulsa has built the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation in 2007, and they are building a park specifically that speaks to this memory. Currently, there holds a sculpture in the park by Ed Dwight, the first black pilot for NASA, and the park has monuments that are important, including a Tower of Reconciliation that began in Africa and wraps all the way around like a timeline with imagery of African American tribulations. But nothing has ever been built up quite like what Greenwood had. It is a special community, and the African American and Native children deserve to know the truth of their ancestors, the part of the American history that has been stolen, and the identities should not be hidden anymore. Please take the time to educate yourself on the topic and read literature online. There is a plethora of videos and websites that go more in depth on the aspect of Black Wall Street. But please educate yourself and educate your children. Thank you for joining me with Just a Kiss.
Fathering together, Father, wind to suck, Father, Son. time to write for the trees to dry.